Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. Brexit is stress testing Britain's political and constitutional conventions to the very limit, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson apparently intent on ignoring the will of Parliament and exiting the EU at the end of October. The eye of the Brexit storm is fast approaching. Well, my guest is MP Heidi, who quit the Conservative Party earlier this year and co-founded a new pro-Remain centrist party. But that bid to break the political mould failed. So what does her experience tell us about the clarity and coherence of Brexit's opponents? Heidi Allen, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
You quit the Conservative Party 7 months ago. You clearly wanted to change the dynamic of the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom. 7 months on, are you ready to say that you failed?
To be honest, I mean, Brexit was the catalyst that drew us together, those of us that jumped at the same time from both Labour and Conservative. But I think we all had slightly different reasons as well. For me, it was just I couldn't tolerate any more being associated with a Conservative brand. I had deep concerns about the welfare state and the way that the government were rolling out the new benefit system. So for me, it was more about the party had changed and not one I could represent. But you're right, Brexit was a big part of it.
It seemed to be, because you, in essence, said then what quite a number of Tories have said since, which is that you feared the party was beginning to look like the Brexit party.
Absolutely. It pushed all the way to the right, and yeah, it feels like we were trendsetters in hindsight now.
But I come back to that point about what changed as a result of what you did, because what we have now is a Prime Minister in place, obviously, since you left the party, Boris Johnson, who is committed, come what may, to Brexit on October 31st, and says he would rather die in a ditch than ask the EU for a deadline extension. So, if anything, the trends we saw 7 months ago are even more so today.
Absolutely, which shows that those of us that made the decision at the time were absolutely right. So I suppose what you could say has changed is that more colleagues now in the Conservative Party have recognised the same. They've been unable to stick by the brand, and they too voted against the government, knowing full well that that would mean they would have the whip removed. So there's a more powerful base now that I think potentially can influence what happens next.
Yes. Now, talk to me about how you see the Conservative Party today. Obviously no longer your party. You still have many friends in it. I dare say some of those friends were amongst the 21 who were fired. Were you hoping that they would make common cause with you, declare themselves to be independent MPs in the way that you have? Because that's not what they've actually done.
Yeah, at the time, I didn't expect any of them to jump. Did I, over time, recognising we would end up most likely with Boris Johnson and most likely looking at no deal, did I know that there would be a significant number that would say, you know, I can't support this anymore? Yes. They are, I think a few of them have different views. Some will stand down. They won't stand in a general election again, a good number. Others are talking about standing as an independent Conservative. Well, you can't have independent Conservative on the ballot paper, and I've been talking to them about that. But certainly it seems to me that they will either have to choose to join another party, stand as an independent, and definitely risk their seats. This is career limiting potentially for all of us.
I'm interested that you've been talking to them. Just give me a sense of the conversations you've been having, and who with, in fact.
So one of the things I've been doing over the summer is building an organisation called Unite to Remain. During the European elections, and it's one of the reasons that Change UK as a party failed, it became clear that people in this country, those that were worried about Brexit, particularly no-deal Brexit, were very eager for Remain parties and Remain MPs to work together, putting the country first rather than parties. There wasn't time in the European elections because it came upon us so quickly. But we do have time to plan for a general election. We have a little bit more time than we did for the Euros. So I've been working with the Remain parties in England and Wales, principally the Lib Dems, the Greens, Plaid Cymru and the Independents, to try and come up with that pact so that when a general election comes, in as many seats as is possible, like in Brecon in the by-election we saw recently, there will be one Remain candidate standing. And I've been talking to those Tory MPs thinking, you know, perhaps they would have to resign the whip. What would their plans be? And seeing if somehow we could offer them some assistance in that.
You talk of a general election. Isn't the truth that you could have had a general election in mid-October, because Boris Johnson clearly wanted a snap election? He could only get it with the support of opposition MPs, including yourself. You denied it to him, and it seems you denied it to him because you look at the opinion polls and you see that the Conservative Party has a substantial, healthy lead in the polls right now. That is the Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, which is determined to get a do-or-die Brexit.
And that's what anybody who knows Dominic Cummings will tell you. He's a data man, and he will say to Boris Johnson, right, the polling, the focus groups I'm doing, push the button now. I can tell you can win a general election now. But actually what opposition parties did, and principally Labour, it was Jeremy Corbyn that conceded and came round to the idea. They realised that if we had allowed Boris Johnson to have his general election, he would have controlled the timetable of it, which means he still would have been able to influence us leaving with no deal. We're not prepared to do that. We're going to push him to the wire. We're going to resist that call for a general election until he goes to the EU Council on the 17th of October.
Well, I'm tempted to say how cynical of you, because in the end, Britain is politically deadlocked. There is no way that the politicians at Westminster can sort out this Brexit mess, it seems. There's no majority for anything. Boris Johnson, the executive, the Prime Minister, he wants to take Britain out on October 31st. Surely you should have acceded to his request to let the people decide in the form of a general election in mid-October, before that October 31st deadline.
But he was game playing, because he could have chosen a date after October the 31st.
No, but he wanted to give the people a chance to voice their opinion before.
But do you know, because I certainly don't, we don't know what date he would have chosen. He's not obliged, he would not have been obliged to give us that general election date before after October 31st. Nobody knew. What Parliament needs to do, and there is growing appetite for this now, and I suspect we would achieve it if we tried again. You're right, we are in deadlock, therefore it has to go back to the British people. It needs that confirmatory vote, a second referendum, call it what you will. I think that is the only thing that can break the deadlock.
We'll get back to your view of a second referendum in a minute, but let us for a moment focus, because I think it is important, if we're trying to understand what is happening to British politics today, it is important to dig into the reasons why your decision to create a new movement, it changed its name from the Independent Group to then Change UK, why did it fail, and fail in a rather humiliating way, within a couple of months of its creation?
I think there's a number of reasons. I don't think Brexit is necessarily the heart of it. I think what we recognised when we got into, and as you say, the opinions really changed. When we first launched, we were riding high in the polls, we were the best thing since sliced bread. The local elections came, which I think none of us had factored in, if we're absolutely truthful. And the polling shifted measurably. We weren't standing in the locals. The Lib Dems did incredibly well, and suddenly they were riding high, and it was clear that we weren't the exciting new kids on the block anymore. And in those European elections, people were saying, well, we've got to vote for who's more likely to win, and that was the Lib Dems.
I just wonder if you, in retrospect, would acknowledge that the way British politics works, you were hopelessly naive to think that you could create a new Remain centrist party with momentum. Because you said this, you said, on your departure from the Tories, you said, party tribalism is a nather to me in this job. Shouldn't we all be working in the country's best interest on the big issues? Shouldn't we be searching for the right and best answers, blind to the colour of any party?
And I still feel absolutely the same way.
How naive. That is not the way British politics works. Never has.
I don't care. It's the best way, and that's what we need to be pushing and pushing.
Well, it isn't the best way if, frankly, you crash and burn within 3 months.
But how ironic that the reason that half of us left was because that's how we felt. But our own party, young in age as it was, wasn't prepared to put country first when the European election polling showed that we weren't the favourite kids in town. Half of us said, you know what, we need to be offering to our supporters a tactically vote, go for the Greens and the Lib Dems. It's not about us. And half the group, unfortunately, still felt that way.
That's interesting. So you were only 11 at the beginning, and half of you, as you put it, refused to think sort of strategically and long term. So you would say that people like Anna Soubry, a fellow Tory who quit like you did, joined the Independent Group, and then called your leadership of the group bizarre, because you basically said, you know what, if the Lib Dems have a chance of winning a particular seat, then back the Lib Dems. Well, because Anna Soubry saw that as a completely bizarre way to found a new party.
But we're never going to break the system if we behave in tribal ways, and that was, you know, it's the great irony, isn't it? And actually the way that Brexit will be fixed, as we're seeing now, finally movement in the House of Commons, is because parties are learning to work together. This issue and what our country needs is bigger than any single party, and we have to put that to one side.
Well, interesting that a number of colleagues of yours, I'm thinking, for example, of Chuka Umunna and Luciana Berger, both, you know, influential Labour MPs who joined the independent group, they've now continued their political journey by joining the Liberal Democrats. There's a lot of talk that you too are going to join the Liberal Democrats, are you?
If I had a pound for everybody who'd asked me that, I'd be very wealthy indeed.
Well, I'm not going to give you a pound, I just want a straight answer.
So the answer is the Unite to Remain initiative, as I described already. That is essentially me helping to broker a deal between the Remain parties. Now, to do that effectively, to make a difference, that we don't split the Remain vote in as many seats as possible, that has to be brokered by an independent. That is why I have stayed as an independent. And that puts me at risk in my career if a general election comes soon. But I'm not prepared to consider jumping into any other party until that piece of work is done, because that is the big prize. Returning a significant number of Remain MPs to the House of Commons that can shift the direction our country is travelling on. That, to me, is more important than my own career. So I'm determined to stay as an independent to do that piece of work.
Well, there's several interesting things there. Are you going to run in your current constituency, which, of course, you won as a Conservative candidate, telling the people of South Cambridgeshire you were committed to Brexit? Are you now, and you haven't had a by-election, so you don't actually have a mandate for your new position as an independent MP, but are you going to go back to your constituents and ask for their support again?
Well, in terms of my constituents, so my constituency voted overwhelmingly to Remain. The reason I didn't have a by-election, you know, it is a truth that people vote for the person, not the party, but regardless of that...
Well, says who?
That is constitutionally accepted. It is the person within electoral rule. That's who you're voting for, not the party.
Well,
but
yeah, that may be a technical response, but to the people of South Cambridgeshire, many of them will think, well, I voted for a Tory, and now I have an MP who doesn't define herself as a Tory as she did before, but says she's something else. I need the chance to re-elect her, or not.
And you're absolutely right. It is the views of my constituents that are the most important. And I've had over 6,500 emails now from constituents, conversations in the street, in the supermarket, in the pubs, telling me I did the right thing. And at the last count, 65 emails from people telling me that they're unhappy. My seat is not a right-wing Conservative seat. It's full of science and technology and academics, and they recognise that what I have done is in the interest of the country. And it seems to me, on evidence, that my constituents are very happy with the position I have.
Does this idea of Unite to Remain and building a strategic, very clever alliance of all the pro-Remain forces to maximise the number of successful victories you can get in the next election, that might require you to stand down in favour of the Liberal Democrats?
Absolutely, it might. My seat in South Cambridgeshire, being a Remain seat and a Conservative Lib Dem target, if you like, that is one of those jigsaw pieces in the Unite to Remain jigsaw, and every seat requires analysis and polling to see who is most likely to win there. And you're absolutely right, that could be the conclusion.
Isn't the problem for the Remain side of this well, it's longer than 3 years, but this protracted argument in Britain, leave or remain, isn't the fundamental problem that the Leave side has a very clear, understandable position? That is, Britain must leave the European Union. 17.4 million people, 52% of the vote in the referendum, voted for that, a clear majority, and therefore Britain must leave. The Remain message is much, much more complicated.
I don't think that's true at all, that the Leave message, that's the great worry with all of this. You know, did people vote for no deal? Did they vote to lose trade ties?
They voted to leave. It was a simple question before them. Do you want to stay in the European Union or do you want to leave it? And they voted to leave.
But it was put to them, there'll be a deal, the easiest deal in the history of all deal making. You know, common market, it'll be going back to the old days.
With respect, none of that was on the ballot paper. It was a binary. But you can argue whether binaries are a good thing, but it was a binary. It was leave or remain, and the majority voted to leave. Well, yeah, you can say that, but the point is, David Cameron put that to the people, and he said this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to settle the argument. You, the people, will settle it. And a clear majority voted to leave, and the fundamental problem for Remain, whether you be an independent, a Lib Dem or a Labour Remainer, the fundamental problem is that you cannot match the simplicity and clarity of the Leave message.
Well, again, I disagree with that. I think it is very easy, as in all these things, milk and ambrosia, a vision of how wonderful the future can be is always going to be easier to sell than the status quo. But the fact is, people did not vote to leave with no deal. People did not vote for overnight, for no transition period, for no regulation on medicines or movement of people or tariffs on goods. Nobody voted to make themselves poorer. And my responsibility as a Member of Parliament, my first responsibility is to the economic well-being of my constituents, the security of this country. No deal would be catastrophic. Yellowhammer has confirmed that to us.
Well, we'll get to Yellowhammer. That is the report which makes predictions
the government's own
about
report.
What might happen to the economy after a no-deal Brexit. We'll get to that. But let us just stick to this notion. You've just said my first priority is the economic interests of my constituents. Surely your first priority ought to be the health of British democracy.
I have to say, if we allow no deal, if we allow Boris Johnson his no deal, which is his preference, the reason Amber Rudd finally resigned, and resigned the whip also, not just her role, was because, as she said, she could see very little effort going into getting a deal at all, and the Prime Minister and the government, the Cabinet, were spending all their time looking at no deal. We've seen how damaging no deal will be to the economy.
But you haven't addressed my question. You've come back to your position that no deal is very dangerous. But listen to Michael Gove and others who say quite clearly, I'm going to quote Gove, but Boris Johnson, many others have said it, if we fail to deliver on the clear verdict backed by 17.4 million people who voted to leave the EU, it would be, quote, a fatal blow to faith in democracy. Now, you argue for a new politics, which isn't about tribalism, not about party, but about real, reasoned debate. Is there no part of you that can see what Michael Gove is saying?
New politics has to be honest. New politics has to tell the public what the risks are, and that is the entire reason why there are many of us, and I suspect a majority in the House of Commons now, believe that a second referendum is the way out of this, to be honest with people.
But Heidi Allen, you have made that point, and I respect that point, but please just say to me, do you not recognise there is some truth in what Michael Gove says about failing to deliver on the referendum result, leading to a catastrophic lack of faith in the British public in the democratic system?
But democracy does not live on one day only. Democracy is not owned by the people that voted on one day only. Democracy is alive and well every single day. We've had more general elections since we had the referendum.
Yes, and obviously overwhelmingly the votes went to parties who were committed to delivering Brexit.
Polling is shifting. Polling is showing, not everywhere in the UK, but in a significant number of constituencies, people are changing their mind and they want to say on this. Because I believe democracy does not exist on one day, it is owned by every person who can vote. I believe there is no greater opportunity to show we embrace democracy than by checking with people and saying, this is your country, this is your future, are you happy with this?
I just want to continue with this idea of trust. A very influential professor of politics, Matthew Goodwin, has studied a lot, he's surveyed a lot, and these are his conclusions. He says, Brexit has widened the trust gulf because for the first time in our national history, a majority of people outside Parliament formally asked for something that a majority of people inside Parliament did not want to give them. Do you understand that?
I do, but the reality is there were lies. There was no description of what the future would look like. There are, Michael Gove, if you want to quote him, he and pretty much every other cabinet minister now in position has said no deal would be catastrophic at some point. They would never allow Parliament to be prorogued. These MPs will turn on their word.
So you're delegitimising all of those who still back leave because you're just saying they're liars?
No, I said they were lied to. People...
No, but you're saying those at senior levels, the leaders of the government today, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, that they are liars. Is that what you're saying?
They will pivot on a point, and that every single one of them has been quoted, particularly in the leadership race, which is, we've just had for the Conservative Party. Every single one of them, Matt Hancock, Jeremy Hunt, all said proroguing, no deal, terrible, and suddenly it's acceptable. It's why Amber Rudd resigned, and this morning, in fact, on Radio 4, said she was urging her cabinet colleagues to do the right thing and look in the mirror as she has.
It's just that when you talk about lies, and one has to be honest, if you talk about lies, then you have to assume that the people telling those things that you regard as lies are liars. You seem to be part of the corrosive, toxic atmosphere in British politics post the Brexit crisis.
I want people to be honest, and that's why, for example, this week we voted to request the Yellowhammer documents to be released, because we think it's important that the British public have their eyes wide open and they're content. If we have a second referendum and they say, you know what, we understand the risks now, we know what might happen to food prices, to food shortages, to medicine shortages, but we're okay with that, then absolutely fine. But my worry is that the majority of people in this country are not content with that. Polling suggests they're not content with that. Therefore, the biggest exercise of democracy has to be to check with them if they're content to proceed on this basis.
I just want to stick with the trust thing, because it seems to me you personally have experienced the changing nature, worrying changing nature of British politics in recent times. There is, according to the head of the Metropolitan Police, a rising threat level aimed at our politicians. And I know that you personally have, since your flip from the Tories to your new independent stance, you have been subject to real and significant threats, haven't you?
Yes, to be fair, that happened before I left the Conservative Party. That isn't something that's escalated as a consequence of that. As MPs, yes, we do face that. I think perhaps, I'm not sure analytically, to be absolutely honest, but I think it's more women MPs who tend to be targeted more. But yes, I've had death threats, people sent to jail throughout my parliamentary career, not just since I left the Conservatives.
But I just wonder, you know, again, if people are making death threats against you, and I believe you've had to sort of modify the way you live your life to a certain extent on police advice because of the atmosphere that's been created, isn't it incumbent upon not just you, but everybody in politics to be extraordinarily careful about language? And when you talk about people telling lies, and recently you tweeted that the Tory party behaves as if it's pantomime season, I am now ashamed to say I was ever a member, they're disgraceful. You know, when you indulge in that kind of politicking, aren't you making the problem worse, not better?
Absolutely not. And if you think I should cower in my home because one person decides that they're going to post my address on social media, I am here to stand up for all my constituents and to ensure their well-being, to make the right decisions and ensure government is scrutinised accordingly.
I'm not for a second suggesting you should gag yourself, but maybe dial down some of the inflammatory rhetoric.
It's not inflammatory to be embarrassed. This is on the evening, on Monday night, when we're trying to have a debate about stopping no deal. And if you had been in the chamber, the laughing and jeering from the Conservative benches was unacceptable. I appreciate there's always a lively atmosphere in the chamber if there's a particular lively debate, but I've never experienced anything as bad as that. And given the severity of what we're facing for our country, that is unacceptable behaviour. That is not inflammatory language. I'm not telling people to rise up and take arms.
Before we end then, let's just talk about how Britain emerges from what we've decided is an extraordinary and difficult situation. You clearly believe the only way out ultimately is a second referendum.
I do.
But should no deal be an option for the British people? Because the polls suggest a significant portion of the country believes no deal, for all of the economic pain it may cause, is still the right and proper course.
Yeah, there are two schools of thought on that, and I must admit I'm not settled yet on the answer. The Electoral Commission would have a view on this as well. But either it would be whatever the latest deal is, if Boris Johnson manages to tweak Theresa May's in some way, whatever format that might be, and the Labour Party, I think, have come out and said that as well, whatever that deal is versus Remain. Or yes, you're right, there is an argument perhaps for a third preference vote that would have no deal on the ballot paper as well.
Yeah, because otherwise how do you ever heal some of the wounds in this country? Because there are millions of people who've looked at Theresa May's deal, they do not like it, they call it Brexit in name only, and they say we want that, they call it clean break. And you're suggesting that it's possible that might not even be an option.
Well, it wouldn't just be up to me, it would be the House of Commons, and the Electoral Commission also would have a view around ensuring fairness and that you weren't splitting the vote. But I do understand why people have a sympathy to that view. I guess the other thing that parliamentarians have to take into account, that no deal would put us in fringe of international law, because we wouldn't be able to uphold the Good Friday Agreement. So I know a lot of MPs have an issue with no deal going on the ballot paper just on that basis alone, because we wouldn't be able to ensure the no hard border in Ireland. So that is a real consideration. But at the end of the day, no deal would make our constituents poorer. This is not an overnight thing. This would take decades for us to recover our economy. And that is, something serious that parliamentarians have to take into account when they're deciding, should we get to that point where a second referendum is approved by the House of Commons. But I don't believe there's a single member of this country that would thank any politician for them losing their job or being less well off. And that, to me, and to many of us, is what no deal would
So for you,
would
now,
happen.
Never mind new politics, the fight goes on.
A second referendum could deal with this almost overnight. We need to get on and deliver that.
Heidi Allen, we have to end there, but I thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.